Hi everyone, I'm Jacklyn Chandler, and thank you for viewing my 2024 Graduate Student Colloquium presentation. My presentation is my final project from my CRIM 611 class, Ethics in Criminal Justice, in which I developed a training module around a sexual harassment ethical statement from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. This training module is designed for police officers to participate asynchronously, where they would cover some background information on sexual harassment's prevalence in a police force setting, which you should know has grown to alarming rates. Even if you struggle to accept the facts you will later see in this training module, this epidemic of sexual harassment in a police force setting should hit a little closer to home due to a case that just came out at the end of the month from Earlsville, Kentucky, just a little less than an hour from here, in which an officer with the city police was just fired for sexual harassment accusations being investigated against him. So without further ado, I will now move forward with my presentation, in which I will continue as if you were an officer participating in this training. Welcome to this ethical training module focused on addressing sexual harassment in a police force setting, which has been developed and presented by Jacklyn Chandler. For a little background on sexual harassment in a police force setting, we must first define sexual harassment for your understanding moving forward in this training module. Oxford Languages defines sexual harassment as behavior characterized by the making of unwelcome and inappropriate sexual remarks or physical advances in a workplace or other professional or social situation. Additionally, for an understanding of the importance of addressing sexual harassment in a police force setting, it is important to note that police sexual misconduct is reportedly the second most common form of police misconduct in the United States, and that an act of police sexual misconduct is reported on average every 5 days in the U.S., not to mention all that go unreported. This training sets forth its objectives and goals to understand the values and expectations of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, to understand the expected course of action in the line of duty, to improve officer response in the line of duty, and to reduce the likelihood of sexual harassment occurring in the line of duty. This training module was developed based on the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Code of Ethical Conduct, which states, "I shall not sexually harass or condone sexual harassment against any person and shall report any violations of this policy to the appropriate authorities." Moving forward, this training is going to ask you about a series of scenarios of which you will be provided a policing scenario and asked to contemplate how you would ethically respond to the guiding questions about each scenario. Then additional information will be provided outlining how an officer would be expected to respond and why. For scenario 1, you will be focusing on a scenario that has an officer-on-officer dynamic. While on duty, you overhear your fellow officers making sexually suggestive comments under their breath directed toward another officer. It is obvious to you that the targeted officer is physically uncomfortable as a result. What would you do in this scenario? Do you believe these officers' actions constitute sexual harassment? If so, would you report these officers' actions? Would you address these actions personally? I now ask you to take your time before moving on to the next slide to reflect on the scenario and contemplate on how you would answer the provided questions. This scenario was based on real-life investigated allegations that were made by female officers from the El Paso, Texas Police Department that resulted in various criminal cases of sexual misconduct being filed against their fellow officers. One of the officers who reported this activity was quoted saying that until we have that conversation and acknowledge the problem, it's never going to improve. An officer in the presented scenario would be expected to report these actions to their commanding officer as sexual harassment as tasked by the ethical code. Additionally, an officer would be advised to address these officers' actions personally, preferably in the moment, though it is not a requirement as long as the incident is at least reported. For scenario 2, you will be focusing on a scenario that has an officer on civilian dynamic. While responding to a call to a club about disorderly conduct, an officer arrives to find a couple of intoxicated females fighting while security attempts to de escalate the situation. The officer takes over the situation and has the individuals stand against their police cruiser for a pat down subject to their arrests. The officer spends extra time groping their breasts and buttocks while making sexually suggestive comments about their bodies. Would this officer's actions be considered sexual harassment? Why or why not? Should this officer be reported for this behavior? Why or why not? Again, you are asked to take your time before moving on to the next slide to reflect on the scenario and contemplate on how you would respond to the provided questions. Based on the provided scenario, this officer's actions would be considered sexual harassment in accordance with the definition. A power dynamic exists between the police and the public, and this officer's actions would lead to this dynamic becoming unbalanced. Thus, this officer's actions would be considered a misuse of the power entrusted to police officers. Observed behaviors such as this should always be reported to your commanding officer in all circumstances. For scenario 3, you will be focusing on a scenario that has an officer on detainee dynamic. While in transit to the local jail with an arrested individual, an officer pulls the police cruiser over on the side of a vacant road. The officer tells the individual in their custody that they will forget their offense and release them if the individual performs a sexual act on the officer, but leaves the decision up to the individual in custody. Has this officer engaged in a form of sexual harassment? Why or why not? Should this officer be reported for this conduct? Why or why not? How would you manage an allegation from a detainee if they were to report an incident such as this had occurred? Once again, I implore you to take your time before moving forward to the next slide to reflect on the scenario and contemplate on how you would answer the provided questions. In the provided scenario, the officer has blatantly engaged in the sexual harassment of an individual in their custody in accordance with the definition. If the individual agrees to the officer's proposal, then the officer could be found guilty of engaging in more misconduct beyond sexual harassment. This officer should be reported for their violation of the ethical code. Finally, if an officer were to receive a report that an allegation of an incident such as this had occurred, then an officer would be expected to report these allegations to their commanding officer so that a formal investigation could occur. For your final scenario, number 4, you will be focusing on a scenario that has a civilian on officer dynamic. You are a new police trainee who is aiding your field training officer, or FTO, with a routine traffic stop. You notice that the civilian is flirting and making sexually suggestive comments directed toward your FTO, with the goal of only receiving a warning for their traffic offense. Would it be appropriate for the FTO to flirt back and or let the civilian off with a warning. Why or why not? Would you, as the trainee, give your FTO a pass for their response to the civilian if they let them off, or would you report your FTO? For the last time, I ask that you take your time before moving on to the next slide to reflect on the provided scenario and contemplate on how you would answer the provided questions. Based on the provided scenario, it would be inappropriate for the FTO to flirt back with the civilian or to let them off with a warning as a response. Officers are tasked with consistently applying the law despite any factors that could sway their decision on whether to pursue their policing duty. If the FTO were to let the civilian off with a warning in response to their flirting, this would be considered an inappropriate use of police discretion. The FTO would be expected to conduct their professional duty by treating the traffic stop as routine and would be advised to ignore or be dismissive of any sexual advances by the civilian. Additionally, the trainee would be expected to report their FTO for the inappropriate use of police discretion if they were to let the civilian off with a warning as a response to the flirting. Thank you for your participation in this training module. Through this training, you have learned more about the values and expectations of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. This training will aid you in applying the expected course of action in the line of duty. Finally, with your help, you can work toward reducing the likelihood of sexual harassment occurring in the line of duty. I implore you to feel free to review this training at any time, and if you have any further questions, they can be directed to Jacklyn Chandler at jkchandler at eagles.usi.edu or your commanding officer. In conclusion, on average, U.S. police spend 652 hours in basic training, with Indiana police participating in an average of 600 hours and Texas officers spending an average of 696 hours in basic training. The training topics that are most often included are criminal law, patrol procedures, cultural diversity, investigative procedures, report writing, defensive tactics, firearms, leadership, ethics, community policing, police vehicle operations, traffic enforcement, accident investigation, handling emotional situations, and first aid/CPR. The lack of universally standard sexual harassment training highlights a systemic problem, and systemic problems require systemic solutions. Therefore, similar and more in-depth sexual harassment training in departments across the country becomes an easily arguable necessity, requiring increased focus to better address the problem from a systemic point.